You know, there comes a moment in a man's life, and perhaps you've felt this stirring yourself, when something quite extraordinary begins to happen. It's not dramatic, mind you. There are no trumpets, no blinding revelations. It's more like, well, imagine you've been walking through life, wearing someone else's spectacles, and suddenly, almost without noticing, you begin to see clearly. And what do you see? You see that the whole game, this elaborate social theater we've all been performing in, is just that, a performance, a mutual conspiracy of pretense that we've all agreed to participate in without ever really asking ourselves why. Now, when this awakening begins, and I use that word carefully because it's not something that happens overnight, the man finds himself in a rather curious position. He begins to pull away from the crowd, not out of hatred, you understand, not from some sense of superiority or disdain, but simply because, well, how do you continue to play a game when you can suddenly see all the strings? Most conversations, if you really listen to them, are about three things: status, gossip, or complaints. Did you hear what so-and-so did? Can you believe how terrible traffic was? My boss is such an idiot. Round and round we go, like hamsters on a wheel, generating tremendous amounts of energy that lead precisely nowhere. And once you begin to see through this, once you recognize the pattern, it becomes increasingly difficult to engage with genuine enthusiasm. You find yourself nodding politely while inside thinking, but what are we really talking about here? What's actually being communicated beneath all these words? The man who is beginning to awaken doesn't become bitter about this. That would be missing the point entirely. He simply stops chasing what everyone else is still chasing. He begins to notice something quite fascinating: the performance aspect of everyday interaction. Watch people at a party, really watch them. Notice how much energy goes into being liked, into belonging, into saying just the right thing at just the right moment. It's exhausting, isn't it? This constant need to maintain an image, to project a certain version of yourself that will be acceptable to others. And here's what happens to our awakening man. Without making a great drama out of it, without announcing his intentions to the world, he quietly steps back. He stops pretending, and when you stop pretending, something remarkable occurs. Distance happens naturally, organically, like water finding its level. People might still wave at him. They might still offer the usual small talk, but the connection, that invisible thread that seemed to bind them together, is no longer there. And why? Because, if we're honest about it, it was never really there to begin with. This is the beginning of solitude. Not loneliness. Mind you, there's a profound difference. Loneliness is when you want connection but can't find it. Solitude is when you realize that most of what passes for connection is actually a kind of mutual distraction. You see, what holds most people together isn't depth, it isn't truth, it isn't even genuine affection. It's habit, comfort, and shared illusions. People bond over complaining about their jobs, over chasing status symbols, over defending ideas they've inherited rather than examined. Our awakening man used to do the same thing. He used to think that was connection. But now it feels more like noise, background static, that prevents you from hearing the more subtle music of existence. He begins to notice how often people speak simply to avoid silence, as if silence were somehow dangerous, as if sitting quietly with another person were a form of failure rather than, potentially, the deepest form of communion. How much energy we expend keeping up appearances, the constant need for validation, for agreement, for reassurance that we're okay, that we're doing it right, that we're acceptable. And once our man no longer needs these things himself, once he's found some measure of inner stability, he begins to see how utterly dependent others are on them. It's like watching people desperately trying to fill a bucket that has no bottom. Now, here's where it gets interesting. He realizes that many relationships survive not because of honesty, but because everyone tacitly agrees to keep the story going. The story that we're all fine, that we know what we're doing, that the emperor is indeed wearing beautiful clothes. But when someone stops participating in that story, when they stop nodding along to things they don't actually believe, well, the whole delicate structure begins to wobble, doesn't it? From the outside, our man might appear unchanged. He still shows up to social gatherings. He's still polite. He hasn't suddenly become a hermit, living in a cave somewhere in Tibet. But something fundamental has shifted in his presence, and people can feel it. Even if they can't articulate what it island, they sense that he's no longer trying to impress anyone, that he's not looking for their approval, that he's simply there, present, but not performing. Some find this admirable. Others find it deeply unsettling, because a person who isn't performing is very hard to read. They're not giving you the usual social cues that help you know where you stand, how you should behave, what role you should play. People might say he's become distant, or too quiet, or that he's changed. What they really mean is that he no longer fits into the comfortable categories they've created for him. He's no longer reflecting back to them their own values and assumptions. Instead, he's reflecting something else entirely, something that doesn't depend on being liked or understood or approved of. You know, there's a beautiful paradox here. The more awake he becomes, the more alone he appears to others. But inside, he's discovering a quality of solitude that isn't empty or hollow. It's spacious, rich, full of possibility. He's learned something that our culture finds almost incomprehensible: how to be alone without being lonely, how to sit in silence without needing it to end, how to be with himself without constantly seeking distraction. What others call loneliness is often just unfamiliar stillness. We've become so addicted to noise, mental noise, social noise, technological noise, that we've forgotten what it feels like to simply be, without agenda, without performance, without the need to be anywhere other than exactly where we are. Most of what fills our days, if we're honest about it, is just noise pretending to be important. Meetings that could be emails that don't need to exist, conversations that circle around and around without ever landing anywhere meaningful, tasks that generate the illusion of productivity while producing nothing of lasting value. In solitude, our awakening man begins to see himself without distortion. There's no one to impress, no image to maintain, no role to play. And that clarity, while perhaps uncomfortable at first, becomes a source of tremendous strength. He doesn't avoid people, but he no longer depends on them to feel complete. And this shift, this subtle but profound shift, confuses others. They assume he must be withdrawn, disconnected, perhaps even arrogant. But in truth, he's simply content with his own presence. He has faced the silence that most people run from their entire lives and discovered something wonderful. It wasn't silence at all. It was peace. As he grows more inwardly stable, he becomes less predictable to others. Not by intention, he's not trying to be mysterious or difficult, but by the simple fact that he's no longer participating in the subtle social exchanges that most people take for granted. He doesn't mirror emotions just to gain approval. He doesn't offer false reassurance. He doesn't pretend to agree when he doesn't. To those still dependent on external validation, this can feel quite threatening. They may interpret his neutrality as judgment, his silence as criticism, his contentment as superiority, but he is none of these things. He's simply no longer invested in managing how others perceive him. And that, my friends, is perhaps the most radical act imaginable in our image-obsessed culture. You see, much of what we call connection is actually performance, a mutual agreement to keep certain comfortable illusions intact. When someone steps outside that arrangement, they disrupt it simply by being present in a different way. He doesn't argue or try to convince anyone of his perspective, but his very presence, authentic, unperformed, unconcerned with approval, makes others aware of their own performances. And that can be deeply uncomfortable. Many of his previous friendships begin to fade, not because of conflict or drama, but because the foundation they stood on was never as solid as it appeared. He begins to see how often relationships are maintained through shared complaints, through routine habits, through the mutual reinforcement of familiar stories about ourselves and the world. Once he stops participating in those patterns, the connections naturally weaken. It's like removing one card from a house of cards. The whole structure becomes unstable. He no longer feels compelled to offer agreement for the sake of belonging. He has no interest in entertaining conversations that skillfully avoid any real substance. And he certainly won't maintain relationships that require him to make himself smaller, quieter, more palatable. This isn't a rejection of others, understand. It's simply a change in what he's willing to invest his precious life energy in. True friendship, real connection, becomes something entirely different for him. Something quieter, simpler, and infinitely more rare. It's no longer based on shared illusions or mutual neediness, but on something I can only call recognition. Two people who don't need each other, yet choose to walk alongside one another without expectation or demand. These kinds of connections cannot be manufactured. They emerge naturally, if at all, and only when both individuals have stopped trying to be completed by someone else. Most social interaction, you see, relies on unspoken contracts. You validate my perspective, I'll validate yours. We won't go too deep. We won't challenge each other's cherished assumptions. We'll maintain the comfortable fiction that we're all doing just fine. Thank you very much. Our awakening man used to honor these contracts because everyone did. It was simply how the game was played. But once he begins operating outside these rules, the whole dynamic shifts. He no longer offers comfort just to ease tension. He doesn't pretend enthusiasm he doesn't feel. This isn't defiance. It's clarity. And that clarity is profoundly disruptive because it illuminates how much of our daily existence is built on the mutual avoidance of truth. As his understanding deepens, something remarkable happens. He begins to need less, not just materially, but emotionally, socially, even intellectually. He no longer seeks recognition or approval. He no longer requires others to confirm what he's discovering within himself. And as that neediness dissolves, so do many of the relationships that were built upon it. This is the great paradox of awakening. The clearer you become, the quieter your life becomes. Not because you're closed off or withdrawn, but because so much of what once filled your time was rooted in a search for something outside yourself. He stops trying to be understood. He stops needing to explain himself. He no longer measures his worth by how much space he occupies in other people's awareness. From the outside, this might appear to be withdrawal. But from the inside, it's the opposite, a settling into something solid and unshakable. He hasn't become cold or indifferent. He's simply no longer dependent. And in that freedom from dependence, there's a depth that could never be found through attachment. Once you wake up, you can't unsee what you've seen. He looks inward and finds peace. He looks outward and sees a world still lost in dream. He observes the false certainty in people's eyes, the roles they perform without question, the beliefs they defend without ever having examined. He sees the constant movement that masks a stillness they've never touched, the endless busyness that conceals an emptiness they dare not face. He no longer envies what others call connection because he understands the price. It often demands conformity, agreement, the willingness to make yourself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort zone. And he simply won't trade truth for the temporary comfort of fitting in. Still, there's a part of him that remembers what it was like to feel less alone, a part that quietly hopes not for crowds or constant company, but for authentic meeting, for someone else who has seen through the illusions, who has faced their own depths, who doesn't need him to be different than he is in order to feel safe. That kind of recognition is rare beyond measure. It cannot be forced or manufactured through effort. He would rather walk in honest solitude than compromise his authenticity for artificial connection. At some point, the solitude stops feeling unusual. It becomes as natural as breathing. He no longer interprets distance as a problem to be solved, but simply as the inevitable result of refusing to pretend. While others surround themselves with noise and distraction, he has learned to live in stillness. While many chase attention and validation, he moves through the world without needing to be seen or understood. This is not the loneliness of the isolated, but the contentment of the authentic. He has discovered that you don't need the world to wake up for you to be whole. You don't need agreement to be clear. And you certainly don't need validation to know who you are. In the end, he walks alone, not as an exile or an outcast, but as a man who has made peace with the cost of truth. And in that walking, in that willingness to be genuine regardless of the consequences, he has found something far more valuable than acceptance. He has found himself, and perhaps, just perhaps, in his willingness to be authentic, he gives others permission to consider their own awakening, not through preaching or convincing, but simply through the quiet demonstration that another way of being is possible. That, my friends, is the gift of the authentic man. Not his company, but his example. Not his approval, but his freedom.